China has emerged as one of the 21st century's most consequential nations, making it more important than ever to understand how the country is governed. Welcome to Pekingology, the podcast that unpacks China's evolving political system. I'm Jude Blanchette, the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS, and this week I'm joined by Jessica Teets, professor at Middlebury College and a member of the Board of Advisors at the National Bureau of Asian Research. She is also a Wilson Center China Fellow and the Templeton Asia Program Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Today, we'll be discussing her work on authoritarian deliberation. Jessica, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You've been on the podcast before, so I'm going to skip the normal question, which is, how did you get into this field of work? Folks can go back and listen to that initial podcast. But I wanted to first dive in. We're going to talk about some recent research that you've been doing, as always, sort of exploring China's political system. But I wanted to ask you about a paradigm which this research sits in, which is this idea of resilient authoritarianism. I think I've had a number of guests on who have talked about elements of this. But for listeners, I wonder if you could first talk about the lineage of this concept of resilient authoritarianism. When did it emerge? What are the big questions or puzzles that resilient authoritarianism is trying to get at?
I think that it emerged mostly in the 2000s. The first usages of the term are probably around like 2010, 2011, that time period. And I think what people were grappling with or trying to understand was why China didn't function like a lot of other authoritarian regimes. So, with an authoritarian regime, you have very few decision makers at the top. They usually don't get good information from society or business or any of the ways to see if their policies are working the way they intend them to work. And so it's usually a really rigid decision-making style without a lot of good information. But in China, we saw that it was a much more flexible style of policymaking. There were policy experiments. There seemed to be good information flows about how policies were working and that sort of policy feedback mechanism. And so I think a lot of scholars sort of examine that puzzle trying to figure out, well, China is authoritarian, so why does its governance system work in a more flexible way? And what they ended up focusing on was they tried to figure out all of the different mechanisms that the leaders were using to test policies before they adopted them, but also to collect good information. And so they termed these mechanisms as authoritarian deliberation, basically institutions that allowed for this process of deliberation, which we see in democracies all the time when they're debating, a proposed piece of legislation on, in Congress or in a parliament. But in authoritarian regimes, that usually doesn't happen. And so in China, they were looking at a range of sort of quasi-democratic institutions that China had adopted, things like public comment periods for proposed laws, town halls, mayor emails or inboxes, just different ways that citizens could share information with policymakers, even though it was still an authoritarian system.
Probably because we're in Washington, D.C., but also in other capitals, especially where the focus is really on Xi Jinping. Something that I don't have a good sense on is how much has the political system, especially at the subnational level, fundamentally changed since Xi Jinping came to power. You're looking at a lot of sort of local examples of China's political system and governance. How much has it really changed? And if we were to be walking around, meeting with local officials and, throw a dart at a board, how much would their day-to-day job in the political system that they operate in be different in 2024 than it was in 2012 when Xi Jinping came to power?
Yeah, so that's a big question. But maybe what I could do is get at it first with this authoritarian deliberation, like how much has that changed? And then I'm happy to talk in a broader way too. So with this authoritarian deliberation, so what we're looking at then is we're looking at this idea that the policymakers are getting better information. It should lead to better policy, but also that there's some kind of procedural legitimacy, right? People feel like they have a voice in the government. And what we've seen with Xi Jinping is really an embrace of that idea. So he has created his responsive government reforms, the Huiying Xingzhengfu. And what he is talking about is, or the way he phrases it, is the idea that he says that the Chinese system is more democratic than Western democracies because it responds to its people's concerns. It listens and it responds. And so that's the distinction that he's making about a true democracy.
It's like
is
an
one
output model
Yeah,
where the
exactly.
output of governance is better,
responsive.
but less input, where we tend to think of democracy as a process.
Exactly. So this is basically a new social contract in China. So the legitimacy is no longer performance legitimacy with just the economy growing. It's much more focused on being responsive to people's concerns, with the idea that different groups of people at different times might have different demands for the government, but that the government will adapt to that and respond to their needs. And so this seems to be the new social contract that he's building in China. And so these sort of quasi-democratic things like public comment periods, letters and petitions, all of these sorts of mechanisms that the government has to collect feedback are all not only still in existence, but they've been expanded and institutionalized, whereas before they were usually done sort of in an ad hoc way. So like public comment periods, for example, every piece of legislation was supposed to have it, but sometimes they would like throw up the draft legislation and 2 days later pass the final, right? So that's not really a meaningful process. But now it's been regularized and standardized, and so there are certain periods. There still is variation, but you have to have a certain amount of time before, and so you could use more time than that, but you couldn't use less. So you have to give people a chance to respond. So what we tend to see then with Xi Jinping as far as collecting information from the people is that he's maintained all of these institutions. He's expanded them in some ways or institutionalized them. And some things like, letters and visits, he's pulled out of the state and into the party under a leading small group structure. So it has direct access to the government.
And what's the evidence that the comments during this period are actually being incorporated into changes of draft laws?
So if you look more broadly at people who do research just on this particular mechanism, the research basically says that the government does use these things. And so sometimes the frequency matters. So like for the domestic violence law that was proposed, that got more public comments than almost any other draft law because there were these scandals where women were attacked in a restaurant, and it was just sort of top of the public mind. And so they got a lot of comments and they responded to those comments. So usually they'll publish what the overall comments are, and then you can see each draft change. So the example that I looked at, just given my expertise with civil society, I looked at the 2016-2017 charity law, which was the first law that tried to regulate the nonprofit space. And then they just revised it. So 2022 through 23, it just passed in December 23. They revised the charity law. And so what I did was I looked at textual analysis to see for public comments, but also for conferences that civil society organizations or research institutes were holding to come together and try to advocate for what they wanted in this final legislation. I used textual analysis to see if the things that the government was talking about in the initial draft are what they ended up talking about, or if the dialogue from experts actually changed the drafts. And what I found is that they're definitely in conversation with each other. So in the beginning of the draft charity law for 2023, the government wanted to talk about disaster-related relief, right? So they're responding to all the different earthquakes, they're responding to COVID and the role that civil society played in that space, and they want to regulate it a lot more. They also were really focused on sort of clamping down on the online crowdfunding in China, because there have been a number of scandals with people sort of fraudulently putting up a claim, collecting a lot of money, and going off with it. And so those are two things that they really focused on a lot. But then the experts were really talking about increasing access to public fundraising. And so what you saw over time is that for each draft of the government law, you could see that they were responding to what the experts were talking about and advocating for. And certain government priorities sort of dropped out of future drafts, or, maybe were consolidated into just one article. And then they used more and more space to talk about expanding the access to public fundraising, for example.
And what are the bounds of this process of soliciting input? So this is basically surrounding draft pieces of legislation. This is not like an open call for the Chinese people to express their misgivings or frustrations with governance across the board, or is it?
No, you're right. It's very, very focused. And so what I found, I started out just looking at this public comment process to see, does this increase this authoritarian deliberation? Does it give good information to policymakers? And what I found instead by interviewing the groups that were trying to advocate for different policies with the charity law was that they actually use it like a policy window. So it opens a period of time where the government is actively saying, we want to change this law. Here's a draft of what we want. We want to hear your feedback. And so this is not like politics as normal. It's a specific policy window where advocacy will work. And what I found was that for most of the civil society organizations or the research institutes, where all the experts are, what they did is they used actually a number of different channels at the same time. So the public comment period is actually not all that useful for them for advocacy because it's an online platform and you're just entering like a sentence or two, right? But what that does is it creates this policy window. And so at the exact same time, they would use 4 channels. They would do the public comment. They would issue public comments on the website. They would also use their WeChat and other social media platforms to try to advocate for what they wanted and, get their opinion out there. They would also try to be invited to private consultations by the government agency that was writing the draft law. And then they would also hold these big conferences. So sometimes it would be a research institute or sometimes it would be a big civil society group like Friends of Nature or the China Foundation or something like that would hold these big conferences. And they invite everyone that they know who wants to work on this issue together. And at the end of the conference, they issue one report. And what's really important about that process is that you're getting a community statement rather than sort of an atomistic statement. So in all the research that I did, I found that private consultations with the government, where experts are invited in to sit with the government and give their opinion, that's the most effective channel. Basically, whatever you give to the government does usually end up in the legislation itself. The publicity on like social media and the public comments, sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't, but it's not as effective. But the other really effective thing, holding these conferences and then you publish a report and you share a copy of that with the government. And what's so important about that channel is it's really inclusive. So the private consultation, it's with the government officials and just the people they invite in. And so they're only getting partial feedback, right? They're getting one group or one person's opinion. But at these conferences, the whole community comes together and they sort of talk through everything that they're seeing and advocate for what they want. And then they have to only issue one report at the end of the day. So they all have to agree on what goes into that. And so when the government gets that information, that's a really comprehensive understanding of the space. And that is what I would argue is the best type of information that you would want from a policymaking standpoint.
Pulling on that thread, I think one of the observations or assumptions that many folks are making is just that the quality of information in getting into China's political system and then also moving up is deteriorating. What's your sense of that as someone who watches this pretty closely? And I guess a related question is, what are externally observable proxies we would have to know what information flows are inside the party state apparatus?
Yeah, it's a challenging question to answer because there is lots of information that is being channeled into the government. So it's not that those sources of information have gone away, but the way that it's collected is different in that this government, this administration seems to prefer these sort of atomistic experiences where basically one individual, one expert gives their opinion in isolation from all the others. And the problem with that is there's no sort of external fact check. So for example, like program evaluations used to be done by teams of academics. They would evaluate a program and then they would publish a series of peer-reviewed academic articles on the topic. And so other experts could then weigh in and say, well, that's a bad measure of that program, right? Or you only measure the first 3 months and we wouldn't see the impact for 6 months. But now what happens is all of those teams, they still do that research, but then they submit their work only internally through the government P-share channel, like where it goes up through the government and they are looking at these reports, but their peers are not seeing these reports and can't offer any critiques. The same thing is happening during this policy window for legislation where, 2 or 3 groups might get invited to come in and sit down with the government. But, let's say one of those groups is only in the environmental space. Well, can they speak to the disability space or any other policy areas? So what the government is getting is they're still collecting all of that information, but because they want it to be in isolation with only the government to hear instead of the entire community to really debate and maybe push back even, what's happening is I just think they're getting partial feedback. So it's not that the information they're getting is wrong, it's just incomplete. And I think that that's a problem for policymaking because they might have good information in one area, but not in another, and that should change the way they draft the policy.
I guess a related question, and again, we may not have an answer, is information flows are one thing. So you have information being collected, it sort of moves up into a system. I guess the other is internal processes to evaluate that information and make appropriate judgments or recommendations. Do you have any sense on how that is evolving, certainly under the Xi administration more broadly?
Mm-hmm. So in some ways, it's the exact same system. So, it will go up the hierarchy till it gets to the top point where the information should be collected. They'll comment on it, right? Like write on it in the margins and pass it back down. And whatever they've written then is what people do at the lower levels. So that part is the same. I think one thing that's different, though, is that through the leading small group structure, and, the leading small group structure is at the central level, but then it replicates itself at each level. And what that is doing is creating a coordination mechanism that we usually don't see in Chinese politics. We only see it during campaigns where they're really mobilizing policymakers. But now that you have leading small groups in so many policy areas, they're serving that function. So let's say that there's an evaluation of an environmental program. It goes up the chain through the government till it gets to whoever the top official is. They write a comment on it, and rather than it just going straight back down that vertical line, it's also going to the leading small group about environmental protection. And so then the people who all sit on that leading small group are from lots of different agencies that all have related policy, and now they're following that same set of commands. So in the policy areas where you see the leading small group structure, it's much more coordinated than we've seen in the past. So it's like the old system is still there and it's been layered over top of by this new system.
This just made me think of a question. I think I've asked someone this before, but do you think that authoritarian systems learn effectively through time how to be better authoritarian systems? And then a related question is, I've wondered how much authoritarian systems systematize learning from other authoritarian systems. There's no sort of journal for autocrats. I'd imagine like a great academic journal where autocrats are writing articles for other autocrats on how to be better autocrats. But obviously in the case of China, they've studied Soviet Union in great detail. We know that they do look at other similar regimes, but this again may be an unanswerable question, but do you think like China's authoritarian system is getting better at being authoritarian over time?
I think they are. So again, my focus is mostly looking at policy making, and I definitely see that they have gotten better over time with making policy and sort of standardizing the steps that they take with each type of policy. And in answer to your question, authoritarian regimes definitely learn from each other. So ways that they do this is they tend to have meetings with each other, sort of closed door meetings that they have with each other. And they definitely talk about things like dealing with social protest. And, they share those things. But also a lot of the people in the government, like government think tanks, study these cases and compile these cases to show like best practices in dealing with, these different things that they face. And so over time, we definitely see regimes adopt practices from each other, whether this is like in coup-proofing and sort of splitting up your institutions, social control mechanisms. We're seeing a lot of like digital control mechanisms that, China is selling to other countries as sort of, they're not just selling the hardware and software, they're also sending technical teams to help train people in how to use these systems. So we definitely see those learning mechanisms.
Which gets to my next question is your sense of how adaptive the political system is under Xi Jinping to sort of new challenges. I think it would probably be the assumptive assessment by many people watching this that under Xi Jinping, the system has just become much more rigid, right? There's not as much crossing the river by feeling the stones. There's not as much space for local level political actors to take initiative and carve out their own strategy. There's much more, top level design. The political space for heterodoxy is being squeezed. So you could come to the conclusion that this system is just becoming far less adaptive. I don't watch this nearly as closely as you do. What is your sense of that question?
Yeah, I think that's true overall. There still is space for like policy experimentation. There still is space for, people to propose solutions, but it felt like previously the system had space in the beginning part of the policymaking process, so it would collect a lot of inputs. But then even during the policymaking process, you could still have people sort of arguing for certain policies. And then for policy implementation, you also saw that people would implement at different speeds or in different ways or implement one part before another. And it led to lots of variation and lots of points where you could impact a policy. And now a lot of that space is gone and it's all been moved to the upfront period. So you can still have a vision of like hukou reform, and you can, write up an application and submit it and become a policy site, a demonstration site for, doing this version of hukou reform. And then that information goes to the government and they pick the policy that they want. But the days where you would just do it on your own and then later share it with the government, that part of it has definitely gone away.
Do you think that strengthens political resilience? This was one of the knocks on previous iterations of Chinese governance, is you had too much local actor autonomy, which wasn't always being used efficiently or for the sake of the nation, but was, rent seeking or pocket lining. So is there an amount where the system should have, if you were advising Xi Jinping in 2012, you might have said, we've got to tighten this up too?
Yeah, I can understand why he, and it's not just him, there was an elite consensus at the end of Hu Jintao's administration that China was going in the wrong direction. It was sort of heading in a direction that made the party irrelevant and just had these sort of local centers of power where they did whatever they wanted, legal and illegal. And now we definitely see that there's a lot less corruption. There's a lot more institutionalization. So if you go into one office in a province or the same office but in another province, the way that you do that process will be exactly the same. They'll require the same information. It will all be the same. So that kind of standardization or institutionalization is probably a good thing, and definitely less corruption is a good thing. What's lost is a little bit of that feedback and having local actors with indigenous knowledge being able to say that policy, the way it's written, will not work in my particular context, and I want to change it. And so we're seeing this really interesting process where, with surveying local government officials and talking to local government officials, they still want that ability to sort of push back and be able to adapt policies at the local level. And there just doesn't really seem to be much space for that. One thing that we see them doing is picking areas where citizens get upset, because again, responsive government means that you need to listen to what citizens are saying. And the central government is very, very touchy about citizens getting angry. I mean, we saw this with the zero COVID policies, right? If enough people are protesting loudly enough, they will back away from policies, even policies that Xi Jinping himself has directly advocated for. And so what I've seen local government do is use citizen unrest to do their pushback. So it's no longer that they can do that themselves, but if they and local citizens both feel strongly about a particular policy, they can use that to push back a little bit. But it's not the same kind of flexible, adaptive governance. And that had good things and bad things. So getting rid of that in some ways makes China much more institutionalized. There is rule by law, but at the same time, you do lose those innovations that like nobody probably would have dreamed up in a central office, but somebody at a local level said, let's just try this and see how it goes. And that's what you're losing.
I do wonder if Xi Jinping is benchmarking progress over the now coming on 12 years he's been in power. If he starts out with an idea that party is indisciplined, corruption is endemic, ideological laxity is so widespread that it's actually corroding the party from within. The PLA is not nearly where it needs to be able to fight and win wars. And we've got, market allocation of resources, which is, dumping scarce capital into, ridiculous effete bourgeois capitalist technologies. Probably thinks he's been pretty successful over the last 12 years. And, we look at this and say, what a failure this has been. Xi Jinping has really sort of attacked the political system in a way that is destabilizing China. And that may be the case, but in terms of the difference between our perceptions and his, that he's looking at this now and saying, look at what I inherited in terms of this political system and how wobbly it is. And yes, we still have issues, but on all the major benchmark areas, I've been able to make pretty significant reforms to the system. I'm not agreeing with him, but I just, in their own head, I bet the reason I raise this is I think we keep hoping he's sort of one stumble away from rethinking his entire approach to governance. And I think that's very unlikely because in his mind, the lesson of the Soviet Union plus the lesson of China in the 1990s and 2000s was, we've got to tighten this system up or else it's going to fall on itself.
And I think this is where I probably differ the most from my colleagues and where we might get a lot of pushback and public comment. But Xi Jinping is not the cause, he's the symptom. There was complete elite consensus at the end of Hu Jintao's administration that way was not the right way, that was leading to party failure, corruption, ineffective governance. The policies that Hu Jintao's administration started, most of them Xi Jinping has continued, but they weren't effective under Hu Jintao, and they are effective under Xi Jinping. And so, in the West, I think we tend to look at everything as Xi Jinping is doing this. But what we have to remember is that he is a product of an elite consensus that put him in that role to do that exact thing. And so we're always looking, I think, for elite disagreement. And anyone who disagreed is already out of the system, right? And so the people who are left are the people who agreed to put him in that position in the first place with this idea of party rebuilding, party centralization, governance around party-led mobilization. And so there isn't elite disagreement about these things. Now, there might be grumbles about certain targets of the anti-corruption campaign or that, Xi Jinping himself has amassed a certain amount of personal power. But what I think that Xi Jinping would respond is that this is party power. I'm the head of the party, so I have it now, but it will be passed on to whoever eventually comes after me. And so that's I think, a big difference in the way that I understand Xi Jinping and his governance style is even if Xi Jinping, let's say he resigns and retires next year and has somebody else come in, I don't expect any of these policies to shift because they came out of a growing consensus that this was not the way forward for China. And most people would say that the policies that he's adopted in China have been successful. And so there could be small changes, but I don't see like a total change in direction, even if Xi Jinping's not at the lead.
I do hear, though, much more overt frustration just over since zero COVID and afterwards from elite in the system. That overstates it, makes it sound like I'm hanging out with the elite from China. But pockets of Chinese society, which 2017, 2018, I thought were fairly in line with Xi Jinping's approach. I feel now like I'm hearing much more, again, grumbling might be the right word, but feeling that sort of things have tightened way too much. And I certainly hear this in the private sector where deep frustration with the strategy. The other thing I was going to say is on the idea of a consensus coming in, a tailwind consensus coming into the Xi administration that big changes need to be made. I suspect that's definitely true, but obviously there are large pockets of party elite who didn't quite understand exactly the policies Xi was going to put in place. I doubt Zhou Yongkang was part of the consensus that Zhou Yongkang should have been purged. I think
he picked the wrong next person.
Sure,
right?
But, I think there's people who I think Xi Jinping went farther, faster than many in the system appreciated, because there's no way he would have been he would have been promoted to general secretary if everyone knew exactly the plan. There would have been far more pushback, from a restructured PLA to a purged security services to, others in the system. So in that sense,
I guess there could have been, but the people who would have been opposed to his policies, there were certain people who have been pushed out of power, and they definitely are the losers. But for something like private business, talking about private business as being opposed to his policies, they definitely are the biggest losers in this whole system. There were other people in the PLA or in the administration who were sort of selected out as well. But as far as an overhaul of a particular sector where they're definitely losers, that's the private sector. So I can definitely understand grumbling there. And I think that that's going to continue because, what I saw when I looked at this charity law and the revision of it is that Xi Jinping's social contract with the Chinese people seems to be with elites that there's going to be this responsive government where they can participate, in policymaking, have a voice of some kind in government if you do it the right way. But for regular people, it seems that it's these common prosperity policies. And so with the new charity law, the way that it was revised, it seems that he's really focusing in on this tertiary distribution. And so it doesn't seem that
Can you explain what that is?
Yes. So it seems like instead of revising the tax code to redistribute income from wealthy individuals to people who need more assistance, instead it seems that he's focusing in on changing the tax law to encourage more charities and more donations, but also that he's going to continue the pressure on wealthy individuals and private businesses to make voluntary, I'm doing that in air quotes here, voluntary contributions. And so the redistribution then won't be in any sort of institutionalized way through a tax code. It will be continued pressure on wealthy individuals and private businesses. And so for private business, when you look at common prosperity policies, and then you also look at the push for state-owned enterprises to buy stakes and have these mixed ownership models, they're definitely the losers of this system for sure.
Your sense of resilience of the system overall, and I'm going to embed this in a paradigm shift here where I think whether that's the discussion of peak China, I think there's just much more of a consensus that, especially since 2020, not only zero COVID in the aftermath, but the worsening geopolitical environment for China. It's much harder for Chinese corporates abroad to have market access. You've got the continuing clampdown and tightening domestically in China. The idea that this system is maybe not running out of gas, but certainly not on the trajectory it looked like it was on in 2017, 2018, when this was near vertical. The curve was near vertical, or our perception of China's growing strengths. Now I think it's the inverse, and people think this is careening downward. What's your holistic sense of regime resiliency in 2024?
Well, I think I'd like to answer that in two different directions, because there's sort of the overall economic direction, and then there's domestically what people think of Xi Jinping's governance. So domestically, what I see is that this responsive government social contract is really effective. It's what most people around the world want, which is responsive government, right? So even inside the United States, a lot of local governments are focusing on just getting things done. It's why we see all around the world that people in democracies vote for authoritarian-leaning candidates, is because they get things done. Like Duterte in the Philippines, we could go through all of these different examples. There's this perception that a responsive government is the best kind. We don't care what the regime type is, as long as it gets stuff done and makes life better for regular citizens. And so for most Chinese citizens, their life is better as long as you have a job, right? If you're a young person without a job, you're probably not super excited. But for example, like if you need to fill out paperwork and get something from the government, you simply open the app, you submit the paperwork, it goes through. Like for most people, when they interact with the government, it's much more effective. You don't have to pay bribes or bring presents in or cultivate guanxi, right? It's a modern government where you click on the app, fill out the paperwork, and get whatever it is you need. And so I think for a lot of people inside of China, this responsive government will generate legitimacy, and that it will generate stability. Now, on the other hand, the policymaking process is increasingly rigid, but it's also increasingly coordinated. And so it's kind of like, it's sort of like a horse race, right? To figure out, whether the coordination benefits outweigh the rigidity of the system. And so I think a good policy area to watch would be the environmental sector, right? Because this is where they really started those governance reforms much earlier. Like by 2016, they had already created the leading small group and done campaigns. So that would be a policy area to watch and say, does the rigidity hurt more than the coordination helps? As far as the overall economy, I don't think that Xi Jinping cares. Like, I think that when he looks at those GDP charts, I don't think he cares about those at all. I think he's really focused on remaking the economy, and he's willing to take the temporary harm in order to get what he wants. So like when he looks at like education technology companies, he says good riddance, right? Like these were creating income inequality where the children of rich families were getting all of these benefits and these children for poor families were growing further and further behind. And so I don't think he looks at that and says, well, those were big employers for the youth who are now unemployed. And instead, I think he says we should have never had that sector of the economy. That's for like, the Western corrupt regimes that have income inequality and privilege the wealthy. So I don't think that he is looking at that as a source of fragility. I think he thinks he's building a stronger economy that more people will benefit from. And then, I guess the truth will be in the empirics, right? Like, does that happen? Is the short-term harm what you need in order to have long-term success? Or does it send the economy into recession?
Yeah, one of these things we might not know for some time. Jessica, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast again. Continue to learn from your careful work on this very important topic.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure as always.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.